This time discussing the other significant anniversary that's taking place this year, namely the 25th anniversary of the 1986 Tax Reform Act, with major participants in it, including John Mueller, who's back with us because he was on Jack Kemp's staff throughout the period, Dave Hoppe, who was his chief of staff at the time, Jeff Bell, who was always around, as we discussed in the 78 campaign, and then Bill Bradley reveals that he was instrumental in advising him and cheering with him and drinking champagne with him when the battle was done. Senator Robert Kasten, Wisconsin, who was a co-sponsor of the Kemp-Kasten bill, which the Republican version of tax reform, and as we said, Alan Murray, who was the other author of the book on the subject.
Still for sale.
Still, it's okay. Okay. So we had Art Laffer as the introduction to the first panel, and now we have a Laffer of a different kind to introduce this panel. Go ahead and play that. This is it's audio.
We'll sing about the greatest thing to ever hit this city, the latest plan for tax reform to come out of committee. Now every lobby has a pack,
each senator a kitty.
Perhaps you'd like to leave right now, the story isn't pretty.
Reagan, Packwood, Rostenkowski, tax simplification.
Nothing's getting simplified, it's just a complication.
We worked on it long enough, it's time for a vacation.
Reagan, Packwood, Rostenkowski,
tax simplification. It started with a Reagan plan to make your taxes leaner. Then Rossi got a hold of it,
but didn't make it cleaner.
Then over on the Senate floor, it changed its whole demeanor.
Don't watch him write a tax bill and don't watch him make a wiener.
Reagan, Packwood, Rostenkowski, tax simplification.
In committee, every member had an alteration.
The lawyers will make millions off of this new legislation. Reagan, Packwood, Rostenkowski, tax simplification.
The plan aroused Bob Packwood from a three-term Senate slumber.
Each time he hit the bottom line, you get a different number. Your big campaign contributors, they'll not let you encumber.
Taxes on our IRA,
but not on fish and lumber.
The plan was getting longer when it should have gotten shorter. Now Packwood has a plan to end this tax reform disorder. He says,
just run the tax code backwards in a tape recorder. The letters are the same, you see, just in the other order.
Neu Takiflip, Missatix, Walknets, or Dukapneger.
They say they'll take the loopholes out.
but in the end they'll stay there.
They all behave in Congress like the children do in daycare.
We re-elect them anyway, so what the hell do they care?
Reagan, Packwood, Rostenkowski, tax or Dukapneger. They say they'll make loopholes out of the end alteration. They all behave on the Senate floor. They all will make erasure. Super fragile, unsimplistic tax complication.
Steps. Panel. What are the origins of Jack Kemp's interest in tax reform? Where did that idea come from?
Well, I know that in 1982, he and Bill Broadhead talked about a tax reform, co-sponsoring a tax reform.
Who was a Democratic congressman from, or was it Michigan? Yeah.
And it would have been a rate-reducing base broadening bill. It never really went anywhere, though they did discuss it seriously. I think I should start by saying that tax reform stressed all the fault lines of both parties, but also stressed the fault lines in the supply-side movement, precisely because of the difference in emphasis as to whether it's things like the investment tax credit or the rate reduction, which have the most oomph. And so he would not have the unified party behind him that he did in the beginning. As your conversation with Senator Bradley mentioned, we did have a poolside party in Jack's backyard in August of '83, at which Irving Kristol made the suggestion that the Republicans would just endorse Bradley Gephardt. We had the kind of man bites dog approach to it that he liked. And we did seriously discuss whether that would be a good idea. Among the folks who were there were Alan Reynolds, Craig Roberts, Richard Rahn, then at the U.S. Chamber, Jeff Bell, Irving Kristol, Jude Winniski, Mark Miles, Lou Lehrman, and Norman Touré. And we discussed seriously, as darkness fell, whether we should just go with Irving Kristol's idea. But as is mentioned in Showdown at Gucci Gulch, Lou Lehrman's point carried the day, which was that he thought we could do better and that it would be better politically for the Republicans to have their own version of tax reform because we could lead to a better ultimate result.
So there were two principles that Bradley had laid down when he did his bill in 1982. Two principles of tax reform. One was that it should not raise or lose revenue. It should be revenue neutral. And the other was that it should not change the distribution of the tax code. It should be distributionally neutral. Now, you can argue over whether his bill was or wasn't, but those were the principles. Was this group sitting around Jack Kemp's pool in August of 1983 in agreement with those principles?
Most of them actually did not have a firm view on the issue. It was my job as Jack's liaison to the supply siders to poll everybody, which I did in the next month. I polled them about their analyses of this specific bill, whether it would fly or not. And we came to the conclusion after about a month's discussion that we could do a lot better. Bradley Gephardt did get the rates down, but it also repealed indexing, which is a big deal when there was still inflation. It got much of its revenue by disallowing the deductions for everything above the 14% rate. And there really wasn't a firm reason for doing that. So you had what we thought was differential treatment of different taxpayers.
But they argue the reason for doing that was this distributional neutrality idea. When you bring down the top tax rate as much as they were bringing it down, it looked like you were giving a big tax cut to the people at the top, and so they made that up by taking away all those popular deductions from people at the top.
Right, but we thought we could build a better mousetrap because the so-called flat tax was very salient at that time, and I think Pete DuPont was actually running on a version of the Hall-Rabushka plan, and that was one of the first plans. Even George Shultz had mentioned it in the context of tax reform to the president. And so it was out there, and it was, apart from Bradley Gephardt, the first tax plan that I analyzed. And the difficulty with this approach is not the flatness of the rate, but what you might call the lumpiness of the base, because the current income tax system, then as now, is based on all income, labor plus property income. But the so-called consumption tax defines investment as investment only in property, in things, but not investment in so-called human capital. And so there was this disparity built into it at the time, so that if you zero out the taxes on the investment in property through expensing of the initial investment, but also zero out the rate of return on that investment in terms of no tax on capital gains, interest and dividends, you've taken all the property income out of the tax base. And that not only shrinks it by about 1/3, requiring a top rate 50% higher, but it also is also very lumpy because 80% of American families get about 80% of their income from labor income. And this is the point of this two-page, on one side of this two-page chart I handed out, where it says the most common and durable source of factions, quoting James Madison, where he said is the various and unequal distribution of property. This chart explains to me why the Reagan-Kemp approach was popular, treating everybody the same, cutting rates across the board on both labor and property income, because it shows that the U.S. voter self-identification tracks very closely with the level and shares of income coming from labor and property income. The Democrats are very strong at the lowest levels of income, but it tapers off toward the top, because as you go up the income scale, you get more and more of your income from property income. And so there's a reason why the Democrats are always trying to load all the taxes onto property income, because these are not their constituents, and to lower the taxes as far as possible on labor income. And conversely, the Republicans are always trying to zero out the taxes, if possible, on property income and load all the taxes on labor income. Both are politically unpopular, but the Democrat strategy is less unpopular because about 50% of voters identify themselves as Democrats, about 40% of Republicans, and 10% as independents. And so to get more than 50%, if you're a president like Reagan, you've got to get all the Republicans, all the independents, and somewhat what used to be called Reagan Democrats. And the way to do that, to make this politically successful, is to get all the rates down and broaden the base as far as possible, to spread the taxes as broadly as possible. That's why I think both Kemp-Roth and the '86 tax reform worked politically, and why more recent efforts on both sides have not worked, because the parties are still focusing on the interests of their constituents, but not seeing the big picture.
I think you're right. The answer to your question was that most Republicans hoped to lower rates at that point. I mean, that was the hope. And I think that the background, including the flat tax debate, is an important part of the foundations, if you will, of what we did. And people were concerned because of the politics of it. I mean, not just the real estate lobby, but there were a number of different people that were. And so we started talking to people about flat tax, and then later about the 86 tax reform. People were concerned not about the economics, but were concerned about the politics. And the politics started to work its way through when it was recognized that Bradley Gebhardt would stay with us, and we had the support of the president, and we had the support of the Treasury Secretary, as Bill Bradley's tape just showed.
Just to go back to this August 83 poolside meeting, was the purpose of was the gathering assembled to deal with Bradley Gebhardt, or was it for some other reason?
It was to figure out what the next step was. Jack was already talking as early as early '83 about the next step in Reaganomics. There was an effort each year after Kemp-Roth to have a tax increase of some sort. TEFRA, there was an '83 bill, '84, and the idea, I think, on the supply side's part was to have a counter move to get the rates down with a base broadening approach and to head off tax increases, which would otherwise be inevitable. And so the idea that I think was in general agreement was that Jack should wildcat with dissident Democrats like Bill Bradley. And as Bradley mentioned, it seemed to be a live option that he would be able to sell the Democrats on the idea for the 1984 campaign, and therefore the Republicans should have their own version of it. And so that was, it's what's the next step, and it was debating.
Did Jack Kemp just did he direct the discussion? Did he just listen as everybody else? I'm just trying to get a picture of what exactly happened
Kemp's
around the
role?
poolside.
Yeah, you have these two competing factions. Irving Kristol says endorse Bradley Gebhardt. Others say, well, no, we don't like Bradley Gebhardt. You need to do your own bill. How did Jack?
It was a more freewheeling discussion because many of the participants stipulated they did not have intimate knowledge of what was actually in Bradley Gebhardt, and that's why it took a month of further polling and reconsideration to.
If I could say, my memory of the conversation is that when Irving said that, there was a stunned silence around the pool. Nobody had a ready-made objection to it. And that moment, the lack of objection, the stunned silence, had enormous weight in what John subsequently described as carrying out the logistics of the opinion, the survey, so to speak.
You were there?
Yes,
Yes.
I must say I don't remember the details of it too much, but I know my basic objection is very similar to my objection to what was done in October 1990 by the elder President Bush, which is that if you keep the rate down but phase out deductions and exemptions, you're raising the marginal rate. In the case of the Bush, it's about 4.5 points. By the way, President Obama wants to do that, so that's 4.5 points added to 39.6, plus the Medicare tax is 2.9. Top rate would go to 47%, plus state taxes. We already have, according to the OECD, the most progressive tax system among major industrial countries. Not so much because of high rates at the top, but because of negative income taxes, the earned income tax credit and child credit in the bottom fifth, bottom 30%, really.
Also, because of the earlier tax rate reductions, every time we cut the rates, the distribution of the tax burden skewed upwards
That's
rather
skewed
than
upward,
downward.
absolutely right.
And we used that in articles at the time, both in predicting the results and then in trumpeting the results when they actually came in.
So afterwards, you did a poll of all these people. How did the poll come out?
Mixed. It was really Jack's accepting Lou Lehrman's argument that it was better to have a Republican alternative as a counterweight rather than putting all the eggs in one basket, that we could do more by going on separate tracks in our parties, because there are lots of dynamics within each party. And Jack was at his best in open field running politically. That's why he thrived in the House. That's where everybody has his own Secretary of State and his own Secretary of Defense. And he just excelled in that kind of changing environment. And
So how much of this was politics? That is, the Republicans had to have their own plan because they had to have a plan that was different from the Democratic plan. And also, to what extent was Jack thinking about running for president in 1988 and wanted another signature program to run on?
I think it was certainly on his mind, but the presidential stuff didn't really gear up until 85, 86. So this poolside meeting, which was a few years before that, I think primarily he wanted to head off tax increases immediately.
Because you folks were, at the time, a little discouraged, right? I mean, you had a big tax increase in 82. You were looking at tax increases in 83. It must have felt in August of 83 that the momentum had shifted.
Yeah, it was absolutely an attempt at a counterattack on the tax increasers. I mean, that was, I can just speak for myself being there. That's what I wanted to have come out of it, because I believed ideologically in lower tax rates being a better system. And but the politics of it at that particular moment were not favorable to that point of view.
I recall also that the increased tax rates were primarily on the corporate side. We're talking about stretching out what had been accelerated depreciation and that sort of thing. And that gets back to that tension between the corporatist type supply-siders and those who are focusing on individual rates. They hadn't messed with individual rates at this point.
Bruce, did you want to say?
Yeah, I think that the history is getting a little bit skewed here. The most important thing driving tax reform, in my opinion, was that right after the tax cut of 81 took place, the deficit suddenly became a big issue. And so that just took tax cuts off the table, right? And so it was in December of 81 that Hall and Rabushka wrote their famous Wall Street Journal article laying out the idea of the flat tax. And very shortly thereafter, there was a very influential article by an economist friend of ours named David Hale that appeared in the Heritage Foundation's journal, in which he made an interesting argument, which was, if we do revenue-neutral tax reform on a static basis, on a dynamic basis, it will raise revenue. And so this became a very popular way to talk about tax raising revenues in a supply-side context. And if you check the historical record, you'll see that by mid-1982, there was already a very considerable amount of discussion about doing tax reform and having some sort of flat tax. David Stockman was talking about maybe putting it into the budget for January. Ronald Reagan made a public statement about this in a speech in California in July. The Joint Economic Committee held hearings on the flat tax in '82, and so did the Senate Finance Committee. So all this, well predates Kemp Caston. And so the ground was being plowed by ideas such as the flat tax that dovetailed into the tax reform debate.
But the flat tax was a Republican idea, right? I mean, there weren't any Democrats who were in favor of a flat tax,
Actually,
were there?
there were
Well,
some,
How about Robert Hall?
But it wasn't distributionally neutral in the sense that
No, there
Bradley,
weren't.
but that was the Bradley argument.
Have almost no behavioral changes in them. For example, they're inadequate at best. For example, if you double the capital gains tax, we'll get just as many capital gains, but people just sit down and write bigger checks. On the contrary, if you double the capital gains tax, guys like me won't sell any stocks.
Well,
Just
I think
period.
Gephardt was really a response to the
To
flat
tax,
tax.
exactly. That's what I was trying
I
to
think
say
so
earlier.
too, yeah. They
The
had a big
flat tax
influence.
debate with DuPont and these articles you're talking about,
Right.
that was 81, 82, the early, and Reagan more than once, at least in my memory, came out, maybe it wasn't in big programs or Saturday radio broadcast or whatever, but it was the Republican Party, I think, understood that Ronald Reagan was for a flat tax.
Well, he wanted to
He supported those ideas because he loved, as we all did, the typical kind of Chamber of Commerce speech against the lawyers and the accountants, and that it takes 10 people to do your taxes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And whether it's send it in on a postcard, all those different things that we were all talking about, we were talking about a lot of those kinds of ideas based on the articles you're talking about before we got into...
What I saw at the time is it was a way to talk about cutting tax rates in a budget-constrained environment.
Hence
which you
revenue
couldn't-
neutrality.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Here's how Jack put in an article after he lost the race for the 1988 presidential nomination. He said, for example, on the economic issues, we began with the tax and spending victories of 1981, but almost immediately a backsliding began, supported by Republican status quo managers and Democrats alike. In the new post-Kemp-Roth climate, it took the form of closing loopholes and revenue enhancement rather than tax rate increases. But these tax increases occurred on a yearly basis, 1982, 1983, 1984, until some of us mounted a counteroffensive by joining insurgent Democrats to put through a rate-cutting tax reform. The tax increasers extracted their price, ridiculous complication rather than simplification, but we did get the rate down from marginal income tax rate down to 28 from 70% in 1980 and double the personal exemption to $2,000. So it was both political and economic, I think.
The dynamic point that Bruce raises is critical here because there's really very rapid growth of real revenues in the 80s because there was rapid growth in the real economy, over 4%. And the share of GDP going to individual income tax is surprisingly constant, around 8% of GDP. And that was true when the rates were 70, and it's true when the rates were 28. We get about 8% of GDP. But if GDP is growing faster, then revenues are growing faster in real terms. So the key thing is, do you have a structure in place that's conducive to economic growth? And we did. And 86 was so successful in some ways, despite the controversy among the capital formation crowd, that it was emulated all over the world. And we had massive rate reductions. Almost every LDC, developing country, cut their top tax rates in half. India went from 60 to 30.
The bill itself was done in static revenue neutral terms.
Yes, where they thought they were going to get revenue was from the capital gains tax and the corporate tax, and they didn't. They got it from the lower individual rate, primarily.
So Senator Caston, how did you get involved in this whole thing? Who approached who?
We weren't part of Jack and I had been working together since when I was in the House of Representatives in the early 1970s. And kind of the beginning of this, for me at least, was at that time I was in the House of Representatives. The Republican delegation from Wisconsin was two, Bill Steiger and Bob Caston. And when I came to the House in '74, Bill and Jack were already talking and working on things like reducing the capital gains tax. I joined into that debate, and from that point, Jack and I became friends and co-sponsored each other's legislations and bills and whatever. And then this morning we were talking about how Jack reached out and helped people. I think starting in '75, he was in Wisconsin at least once a year, bumping around an airplane in and out of Waukesha or Oconomowoc or wherever, helping me. And in '78, I ran for governor, lost. In '80, I ran for the Senate, won with Jack's help against Gaylord Nelson, and that was the year that we took over the Senate. At that point, we started talking together about the opportunities, whether it was capital gains tax reduction, all the other kinds of efforts, and the people like John and others were, involved in this. My staff person at that point was Dawn Gifford, who had been a former Kemp staff person, came on our staff in part because of her experience, limited experience, but her experience with John and Jack. And so, as I said earlier, we're considering capital gains tax reduction, we were considering enterprise zones, we were considering other kinds of positive changes that, more than anything else, I think that the thing that brought all of our thinking together was incentives. That incentives affect human behavior, and they can make a positive difference in our government and in our society. And that people respond to incentives, and that we need to put more incentives in different ways, whether it's enterprise zones or tax reduction or capital gains tax reduction, whatever. But the overriding theme was incentives.
Don Reagan is studying tax reform during 1984. So was the Kemp staff or Kemp himself in touch with Don Reagan and the other people who were working on that? And did he have a sort of a dialogue while that was underway?
Well, we were following what was happening in the development of Treasury One, and because we knew a lot of the people who were in the administration, we didn't have a whole lot of input. We thought that what we saw, the rates were coming out rather too high. Their rate came out actually above 35%, but they shaved it just kind of arbitrarily. And that was too high for Jack. He thought 35% we could do better than that. And as indeed we did, but it took an awful lot of...
But so the fascinating thing about that period was, and I think this was mentioned this morning, you had Reagan call for tax reform because he thought Mondale was going to, and in fact Mondale wasn't going to. He didn't like the idea. It didn't fit with his politics at all. And then you had Reagan say, report back to me in December 1984 after the election. And
which caused derisive laughter.
Laughter at the State of the Union address, which doesn't happen very often. So clearly... It does now, maybe. Didn't in those days. So we're talking about a different Washington, right? So, which just raises the point that nobody, in fact, there's a personal piece to this. The reason I was like cub reporter at the Wall Street Journal, the only reason I was allowed to cover the damn thing was because nobody thought it was going to happen. The president didn't think it was going to happen. So did you all think it was going to happen, or did you feel like you were pressing a futile effort?
I thought it was going to happen. I mean, I had been involved in the 81 tax reform, and whenever anybody says something is politically impossible, I can just say, well, I've been part of at least two initiatives that were
politically impossible
until the day they happened.
We thought it was going to happen. We also thought it was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Economically and politically. It was the right thing for us to do as Republicans.
We thought we had the
politically.
Look
at the Jeff Bell arguments, debates with Bill Bradley, whatever. We thought those debates around the country would be helpful to us as Republicans, and we also thought we'd be doing the right thing. Yeah. So there wasn't a downside. Yeah. We hoped it would happen. Whether we believed it would happen or not, maybe. We certainly thought there was a good chance because the president was for it.
On the political side, you had it going on in the summer of '84, the Republican convention, and the biggest issue in the Republican convention was a comma.
Was what?
The disappearing comma.
Oh yeah, what?
In the draft. Tell us about that. In the drafts, what you would do with the drafts is we would write up drafts, and Senator Lott then Congressman Lott was the chairman in 1984, and I was working for him then. And we would write up the drafts and send them to the White House. And they would keep coming back with things that equivocated on taxes and on tax reform.
On tax reform.
On tax
This
reform.
is as they're developing.
Yes, and the person who was reading them at the White House was Dick Darman.
No, and Jim
Yeah.
Pinkerton
Yeah.
were behind the curtains, and I was the chairman of that subcommittee on economic reform, and Dawn was my staff person. We were always trying to make it unequivocal.
Language
And so where was the
Tell
us about the
literally got to the point where Senator Lott called Jim Baker and said, I don't want to see Dick Darman in Dallas. I don't want to hear that he's in Dallas, and I don't want to hear that he calls anybody in Dallas. The only person he can talk to is me. Nobody else at any time, and I don't want him there. And he wasn't. He was in Maine.
The language in question was a sentence that said, we oppose tax increases which would hurt economic growth. And so I forget who it was that realized that inserting, Bill Grimmin, inserting a comma after tax increases, comma, we oppose tax increases, comma, which would hurt economic growth. And that was a huge...
And Darman was trying to keep the comma
out. The whole thing was about a comma, exactly.
We literally had, as the Senator said, he was the chairman of the subcommittee that was doing this in order to make sure we got through the whole process without this going wrong.
And all the people that you talked about were the people advising us. I mean, they were the people that had testified in the hearings beforehand, your pool party, basically, and the whole, group of other people.
There was that, and I think the gold plank was the other one. A dollar as good as gold was a huge fight, but it stuck.
But this is similar to the Bill Brock story we were talking about this morning. I mean, how much opposition was there within the Republican Party to the idea of making tax reform central?
I think that among the kind of traditional, I don't know what Bill said this morning, but among the kind of traditional Republican Party, I would say the static Republican Party economic thinking, there was a lot of concern about it.
Bob Dole was
and I would begin with Dole, and at that point was the chairman of the Finance Committee or ranking member during part of those years, basically chairman. And there was a lot of concern in corporate America about lowering tax rates. And maybe it's related to the issues that you were speaking, Alan was speaking to earlier, that they weren't so sure. We were kind of like a group of vigilantes out there on the edge, and we really weren't in the main line where everybody wanted us, and especially that platform, because that we were trying to make a statement there, and all of a sudden it came from the administration.
But tax reform, if it's going to be revenue neutral, does raise taxes on some people. So that comma would imply that you're not going to raise tax, which is now religion in the Republican Party. Never raise taxes on anybody, right? So what tax reform would do would be to lower the rates, but also raise taxes by closing loopholes. So how does that square
this
here?
was not a Grover Nyquist interpretation in those days that you can't close any loopholes. The whole idea of tax reform was to close loopholes to get the rates down.
But there were people who were defenders.
We called it fair tax.
But there were defenders of the loopholes who were
absolutely.
Republicans.
Absolutely.
The whole, as I understand it, the whole House Ways and Means Committee Republican.
Well, if you were on the Ways and Means Committee and you'd been lobbied and entertained for all these years by people who want loopholes, I mean, this is the kind of discussions we used to have.
Bob Packwood.
Yeah.
Well, he saw the light. He saw the light.
There's a real simple way.
And Rostenkowski is the same.
There's a real simple way to describe what happened with the two bills.
Yeah.
Corporate America was for the 81 bill. Corporate America was not in favor of the 86 bill until it became inevitable.
If you ask a corporate CEO about taxes, he'll say, don't tax my company, tax my stockholders, my workers, and my customers instead. The trouble is that is the company. And the success of the company depends on their stockholders, their workers, and their customers. So this gets to the individual versus the corporate.
The political attitude was different back in those days. I mean, compare GE's non-payment of taxes in '82, which was a scandal, and its recent non-payment of taxes, which Nobody gave a crap.
Also, it wasn't entirely true.
Well, that's beside the point. I'm talking about the political reaction. Was very different, I think, over that time period. People reacted, were very upset that corporate America was getting away without paying its fair share. And today, I think people are really much more accepting of the idea that corporations don't pay taxes, individuals pay taxes.
Or much more cynical about,
well, however you want to put it, I'm not sure.
about our government and our corporations.
Well, GE builds windmills, so it's got to be a good company. And they get tax credits for both. They get tax credits for
And they're good at
building
nuclear
windmills.
power too, right?
Yeah. As Bill Bradley mentioned, there were some joint events between Kemp, Senator Kasten, Bill Bradley, and Dick Gephardt, and at least one of those events was to bring together about a dozen business leaders who were for it and try and point out that there were winners as well as losers in the event. But yeah, it was uphill because it was not a consensus thing, and in the end, it turned out to be difficult.
Of course,
just to get
more businesses began filing as individuals under Subchapter S.
Was Kemp at all on the outs with the Reagan administration because he opposed TEFRA and other tax raisers in the interim? I mean, he was against all those.
I think that
tax increases, right?
Reagan mentions in his biography Jack's opposition to TEFRA, but it was in the context of it was supposed to be a deal in which we got $3 worth of spending cuts to $1 of tax increases, and Reagan bought this argument, and he says in Jack's opposition that Kemp is being unreasonable. But in fact, in the event, in the diary, which winds up in his autobiography, but in fact, Kemp had a correct assessment of what was going on, that we weren't going to get the spending reductions, we were going to get the tax increases. And
didn't Reagan come back later and realize he didn't
Yes.
get them? I mean, and he said, he didn't necessarily say opposition was right, but he did say
he was
maybe disappointed in, or we never got or we got that first and never got the reductions. Next time, we've got to get the reductions first. I can't remember how he said it, but there was something like that.
Yeah, there was in this time a growing feeling that President Reagan never held a grudge against anybody. I mean, he might oppose you, but the next fight's the next fight, and we're all good guys, and that wasn't the feeling people had about the White House staff. These guys took names, and they had lists, and they looked at them every night before they went home and turned off that light in the office. And so you had a feeling that there might be somebody who was going to make you pay for this later on.
This is Baker and Darman you're talking about. And then, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, but
then they become allies.
That was exactly right, except that we all believed, and I know Jack believed, and I believed, that President Reagan, if he made the decision, would be on our side, not the side of the staff.
Yeah.
that was the crust of it. He trusted.
We believed that, and frankly, in different ways, shapes, and forms, Reagan told us that personally, and to wider audiences.
Well, so is that why then? So then, after the election, Baker and Darman then moved to the Treasury and owned tax reform after having fought you at the convention. I mean, did you feel like that was the end of it at that point, or?
Well, I didn't feel that way. I mean, John was more dealing on the detail with them, because then we started getting down to real, how did this work?
The Baker-Darman Treasury was constantly creating problems to the Kemp-Kasten or Bradley Gephardt type approach, undercutting the efforts to double the personal exemption, for example. Baker and Darman came to Jack's office, and Secretary Baker sat sideways on his couch with his cowboy-booted feet up, and Darman sat next to him and tried to explain to us that it was impossible to raise the personal exemption, which was then $1,080, to more than $1,300 without imposing a value-added tax. And so that set the task for me to figure out how to pay for it. But he every step of the way through the process, they were always trying to reduce the deductions, and especially the standard deduction, and kept the rate far too high.
But we talked about this morning. I mean, they also were, so Baker and Darman, as the legislative process begins, their work in the House, they are working with the Democratic majority. They kind of stiffed the Republican minority, but they always kept Kemp in the loop, didn't they?
They had to. They needed Jack. We needed each other. It was. it was kind of a team of rivals approach to it.
Codependency?
Yeah, you might say that. Baker's attitude, I think, was he wished that tax reform had never been dropped in his lap. But because he and the president were on the line for it, that he was going to try and make it work. But Dick Darman was always too clever by half, and you always had to find out which half was.
I will make one point, and then John will tell you how he figured it out so that they got the 2000. Because the 2000 became a very important symbol as you went through this process of what you're going to do for individuals and families. And for a lot of Republicans in the House, this was the growth. You had the moral majority and some other things. On the economic side, what they cared about more than anything, now they were in favor of tax cuts, but what happened to the family? And the 2000 was an article of faith. And you had a whole lot of House members for whom this was an article of faith. And it became clear as we went through this that the Treasury Department did not believe it to be an article of faith in any way, shape, or form. And so there was a column at that time in the Washington Times called Alice on the Potomac. And nobody knows who wrote it, except a couple of us who know who wrote it.
Who wrote it? Who wrote it, yeah.
Who wrote it? Dick Thompson wrote it. And he had to deal with it.
Was who?
He had been Jim McClure's chief of staff, and then he had been the head of the policy committee under Senator Tower. And he had to deal with them that he would write it as long as they told nobody who wrote. Because if it had ever been found out, he was going to be fired, and that was it, and he knew it. But he was able to put things in. So I talked to Dick, and I said, let me tell you what's going on here. So he was reporting all the way along what the Treasury Department was doing to try and undermine the 2000. And it was making the Treasury Department sort of unhappy because they couldn't figure out who was doing it and who was being told and where it was coming from. And they kept getting groups of House Republican congressmen screaming at them. We know you're doing this. And if they'd say no, they couldn't make it stick because all this stuff was appearing in the newspaper.
Why did Jack Kemp believe that the 2000 personal exemption was so important?
I could answer that. I mentioned that there was the original version of supply side really focused only on physical capital, but I think Jack got the human capital argument that people are just as important as machines, and in fact, investment in people provides about 2/3 of our economy, and investment in property only about 1/3. And so he saw it as a pro-family issue, but also as a fairness issue. Under the tax code then, you were taxed even though you were below the poverty level, and you were not made whole if you were raised children. And it was a question of just simple fairness in treating humans at least as well as machines. And that was the impetus. And it was not easy to figure out how to pay for it. But we worked on the House side, especially with Congressman Henson Moore, who was on the Ways and Means Committee. The Roskinkowski version cut the personal exemption to $1,500, and I think less even for dependent children, and they raised the top rate to 38%, and by keeping a lot of other junk. And Henson Moore, after working with us, proposed amendments a few times in the committee to restore the $2,000 exemption. And I was able to figure out how to do it. It turned out that the distribution of the personal exemption, the reason Darman said it could not be increased was that people only have children when they can afford to have children. So if you were increasing the personal exemption, apparently it meant that you were skewing the tax cuts toward the upper middle class. But what I found by looking at the revenue figures in detail was that the distribution of the personal exemption was about the same as the consumer interest deduction. And it suddenly made sense to me why this is. If you're going to pay for your kids' college tuition, if you pay for a car or a house, you can pledge the car or the house, your bank can take it over, but you can't do that with your kid. And so I realized that what people were doing was borrowing against their house or their boat, and deducting the interest and writing that off their taxes. And so the answer seemed to be clear: double the personal exemption and get rid of the consumer interest deduction. And it turned out to be kind of a wash. We had a smaller standard deduction, but a larger personal exemption.
To Mort's question, though, about why was there so much passion around this issue? I mean, if supply side economics was about incentives, what was the incentive behind the doubling of the personal deduction? It's an incentive to have more kids. But
Paul Bluestein once told me, and with a laugh, that's the ultimate supply side.
Just have more kids.
I worked on I should mention, under Paul Weirich's, with Paul Weirich's cooperation, I worked on a pro-family coalition that about 30 different groups that was just focused on the need to double and then index the personal exemption. And we went in and had a very interesting meeting with Bob Packwood, who was not known as a big pro-family advocate that I could get to later. But there was the pro-lifers, the social conservatives were very big on doubling the personal exemption, and we brought that political power to bear on the process.
Bring the social and the economic issues together, whereas previously they'd been separate. Now
was that the way Kemp thought about it? It was an opportunity
to
heal the divide.
I think John said it right when he said that there's a fairness issue as well as a pro-family issue for Jack.
This is a different constituency. The family group is a different bunch of people. They're not necessarily supply siders.
Different from what?
Well, they're making everything in this bill as a supply side. That wasn't. I don't think it was, but it was a fairness issue.
I disagree.
You think it was? Okay.
Well, Bluestein got it.
Anecdotally, Jack told me about somebody asked him, said, they were saying they were talking about Cato and Heritage, and Jack said, well, the difference is this. At Cato, they don't have kids, and at Heritage, they do.
Grandkids. We have grandkids at Cato.
David, during this time, didn't you and John and others develop a certain, that it was almost a disincentive for people to be together? There were, if I remember, we had statistics and things saying that if these two people are separated and she's taking all the deductions, et cetera, that if he moves back into the house, their income, and we had that, Jack had that in his Jack had that in his head, I had that in my head, and we had I don't know exactly what the numbers were, but we took examples of where people were better off if they were on government assistance, particularly. Yes. That there was a disincentive for the family to remain together, and that we believed was wrong. So once again, it's an incentive, and the government had the disincentive. So the umbrella here, the thing that brings it all together, is incentives make a difference, and we wanted to have incentives to have a family together.
But politically, this was an appeal to the pro-family, right to life, whatever that group is.
Sure.
As opposed to, now, to what extent was it a populist thing? In other words, it would appeal to Democrats who were at the bottom of, more likely to be at the bottom of the scale. What's the balance there in Kemp's mind?
It was, in fact, a way to go across party lines because labor income is simply the return on investment in human beings, and Republicans, as I indicated, are less dependent, but Democrats are more dependent on labor income, especially as you get toward the bottom. So it was a way
and Kemp was conscious of this.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Democrats like Pat Moynihan agreed with us. This was part of the underpinnings of a lot of his thinking.
Okay, so the bills are all introduced. The legislative meat grinder is going. What is Kemp's role in the 85 process? Again, he's not a member of Ways and Means. Presumably, he is now leadership. He's now in the leadership, and presumably he has more status than he had in 81. But what role did he take with the Ways and Means people? What role did he? What was his relationship to Rostenkowski in particular?
Well, Rostenkowski kind of had he looked down, I think, on more junior members in either house. He was kind of sensitive about his prerogatives. But Jack had a good working relationship with him, I think because of his pro-labor credentials. Jack was working at the same time, as I mentioned, with Ensign Moore in the House. He was talking to Bradley a lot, having joint events with Bradley on both taxes and monetary policy in late 80. It was in 85 and 86. So they're working on a couple of different issues together. And and he was writing memos or calling them on the phone all the way through the process during the House enactment and then afterwards on the Senate side.
Politically, there were a lot of House Republicans, particularly. You can speak to the Senate better than I can, Senator. The House Republicans who, if Jack Kemp said no, it was no. If Jack Kemp said yes, it was yes. And there were a pretty good block of those. And they looked to Jack. On tax policy, they didn't look to Barbara Conable. They looked to Jack. Not that they didn't respect Barbara Conable, and he was intelligent, and fair, and decent man, but Jack Kemp was their leader.
But so what during that period as it's moving through the House, what's the mechanism for that input to get into the process? Were there periodic meetings with the Treasury that Kemp was involved in, or what was the...
Well, there were leadership meetings on the Republican side where you would have the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee and the leadership meeting and talking about these issues. So Jack had a chance in that forum to make sure his views were known and Barbara Conable understood it. In addition to which, John was doing a lot of back and forth with the Ways and Means staff. Usually they had to check their guns at the door before they went into any meetings or made phone calls. But there was a lot of back and forth where John would be providing things and they'd critique him coming back.
If you look at the Ways and Means Republicans, was there much support for tax reform there, or were they mostly trying to undermine the effort?
I think there was support for tax reform there. Now, exactly how it went, for Henson Moore, as John has already brought up, and frankly, I don't remember that Mr. Conable was in any way opposed to it. It was sort of, this is where we were going, and he was a good soldier, and he was going to do it.
The thing, though, is that by Darman tying this Treasury strategy to Rostenkowski, that kind of tied their hands because it wound up with a rate that went higher and a personal exemption that went lower as we went through the process. And as Moore's amendments were defeated, then the House Republicans became more and more disaffected with the whole process. They didn't trust Darman as far as they could throw him. And so by the time it got to the final bill, which had a 38% top rate, a reduced personal exemption, reduced incentives for capital formation, it was just too much for them.
And the result of that was when it was brought up in December, just after Thanksgiving recess in '85, they brought it to the floor, and the rule was defeated. It was much easier to vote against the rule than it was to get into the tax bill.
And that's a crucial moment.
And Jack Kemp votes against it.
He votes against the rule. I think it was virtually unanimous Republican vote against the rule.
And the argument at that time for voting for it was keep it going, get it to the Senate, and improve it in the Senate.
Except that Packwood had announced the morning of the vote that once he got the bill, he wasn't going to do anything with it. That it was going to be basically the Rostenkowski bill. And that was just too much.
And Packwood did that in part because he didn't particularly want the bill, did he?
Yeah, he was not enthusiastic.
He was not in favor of the rates.
So you have a whole series of people here who didn't want the bill.
I don't think this was, correct me if I'm wrong because I wasn't in the House, but I think that the answer to your question is this in part was an inside job with Jack Kemp working with the Ways and Means Committee and John and others working with the staff. But I think it's important.
And Jeff being a go-between between Jack and Bradley as well.
But it's also, there was a huge outside job going on that was going on outside, for sure, outside the Ways and Means Committee and the Finance Committee. There was a whole going on in the Republican Party and in the business community, in the Wall Street Journal, in other places, that was developing momentum for a decent bill. So when it came to all of a sudden the average congressman had to vote, the average Republican knew from what they had read over the last 6 months and what they'd been learning about through the Republican National Committee, through President whatever, that this was not what. So it's not just the inside game. There was a big outside game going on that was very successful.
Now, between those two votes, because there was a second vote taken on virtually the same bill on the rule about a week, 10 days later. And in that time, a couple of things happened. I will tell you an anecdote of one of them, and John can tell you on the substantive side what was going on. And I remember vividly, if you've been inside the Capitol on the House side, in the front, eastern front side, there's a stairway that goes up, and it goes up to the third floor where the Rules Committee is. And it was sometime fairly late at night, and Jack's running up, and I'm following him, and John's following me. And I'm taller than Jack was.
And I'm taller than Dave.
But Jack was somewhat wider in the shoulder than I was.
But he's also higher up in the
He
stairs.
was 2 stairs ahead of me. And I'm going, you can't vote for this. You cannot vote for this rule. It's terrible. This bill is just as bad. And he turns about halfway up there, turns and he's leaning over me. So I'm a head shorter than his. And he said, I am going to vote for this bill. Nothing will stop me. We must move this forward. We can't stop tax reform here. Now shut up. I don't want to hear another word out of you. And you sort of, So I shut up.
But that's a complete turnaround from 10 days earlier
It
on
was.
as you say, the same bill.
It was.
Well, it was, but it was only with assurances from Reagan that Reagan would veto the substance if it was not fixed, according.
And fixed meant?
It's
35%, 2,000. 2,000 was one
and
of them.
no higher capital cost than Treasury won. And he got the first 2 in a letter from Reagan and the third in a letter from Baker.
And that saved the bill.
And that was the antidote to Bob Packwood saying, I'm going to pass the bill the way they give it to
Packwood
me.
immediately accepted the ground rules and went to work.
It's important to remember that one of the things that was irritating the Republicans at that time is that the Treasury had this habit of primarily negotiating with the Democrats because they were in the majority. And so there was a tendency to treat the Republicans as if they were just going to rubber stamp, and it was up to the Treasury to do the negotiating on behalf of the Republicans. And I think there was very much a revolt against that kind of, not being, treated poorly. And one of the reasons for the vote against the rule was to get Treasury's attention and say, you better give us some attention and not just spend all of your time with Danny Rostakowski.
So was it Kemp who invited Ronald Reagan or insisted? How did it go
was very much involved in that particular
to get Reagan to come up to address the House Republican Conference?
Gingrich was actually heading part of the effort, to just kill it and start over again.
Yeah.
But Jack got on the horn to the White House to get Reagan, the assurance that Reagan would come and address the House Republican Conference, which was a risky move for.
Who did he? So he.
It was a hostile group.
He calls down to Reagan. Is Reagan still White House Chief of Staff?
Reagan was the chief. Yeah.
Yes, he was.
At that point, he was.
So Reagan presumably was a supporter of this whole effort, right? Because he'd invented the plan.
And there's a
Did
tension
Did Kemp talk to Reagan in this case, or did he talk to Reagan, or who did he talk to?
I think there were leadership meetings where. I know there was a leadership meeting with Michael and Kemp when they drafted a letter for the president to send to the Republican conference, and that was sent from them to the White House. At the same time, they were asking Reagan to come down and address the Republican conference, and it was a fluid situation, so it wasn't clear what was going to work. But Jack was just trying different things.
Russell has a question.
A subtext to all of this, in relation to your question about the larger community, is Republican presidential politics for the next election. I'm just curious about the extent to which the positioning on for a presidential campaign is a factor, if at all. Was it just the presumption that Bush would be the nominee, and was he at all a player in these efforts?
Well, we were certainly on Jack's staff operating under the impression that he was going to run for president in 1988, and certainly having been a leader in the tax reform effort and having been a leader of the pro-family movement were central themes to his campaign.
But Russell asked a really interesting question. I can't recall any intervention by the vice president.
Who was Jim Baker and Dick Darman? Who were they?
You mean who were they acting on behalf of?
I don't think they were acting on, I would argue they weren't acting on behalf of him, but there were very few people in town who didn't feel that if you started separating out Republicans and where they'd go with people who might be candidates in 1988, excuse me, it was clear that the Treasury Secretary and Mr. Darman would be headed very supportive of, as one would expect, of the Vice President. And so people just assumed that but could I point to any single thing where the vice president was involved in this? I cannot. If there was, I have no idea what it was. But it just, and once again, he was loyal to the president and loyal in a very deep and heartfelt way. And it served him well in '88.
Were there any other Republicans in the mix at this time who were trying to either kill it or support it as one of their signature issues?
Well, Dole ran.
But Dole was leader already. By this time, Dole was the Republican leader, the majority leader of the Senate.
Both his first year.
Yes.
Both Packwood and Rostakowski went through brief moments where they thought they might run for president
Yeah,
at some
yeah.
point.
I mean, and so you had Dole, who clearly was thinking about that, but once again, at least to me, he tended to leave things on the House side of the House. He had a lot of business to do over on the Senate side, he knew it. In addition to which, having been chairman of the Finance Committee, he wouldn't have liked it if Howard Baker had stepped on his toes, and Senator Baker did not do that, and he didn't want to step on Packwood's toes. He was deferential to his chairman.
And voted with him, to be
yeah,
fair.
yeah, and yes.
I don't know if it was in the letter that you talked about, John, but the key to all this wasn't, at one point, Reagan said he would veto the bill
Yes.
if
Yes,
the rates
absolutely right.
came at the end of the whole mix. So we basically, or it was decided to let this go and see. But if it doesn't get fixed, we know we've got Reagan
That's right. Getting
as
Reagan
the veto.
involved in the process
and
was
he was
the
there,
one thing that Jack could
which
bring,
made
because
it possible for it to get across to the Senate.
the only reason supply side worked was because you had two people believing it at the opposite ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, Ronald Reagan in the White House and Jack Kemp in the Congress. Most of the people at either end did not agree with them, and were often trying to undercut. But
when Jack Kemp votes against the rule the first time, is this because, as part of a strategy, because Bill Bradley called over there and said, "What are you doing?" The question is, was this part of a strategy to get Reagan involved in this, turn Treasury around, get that letter, and then he knew that he was going to vote for it if that came about, or did he change his mind?
I don't think anybody had thought that far ahead. Things were happening very quickly at that time. I mean, first of all, you've got this bill. Secondly, you've got questions among the House Republicans. Thirdly, you've got Packwood making a statement, and then you've got a vote. And it just blew away from anybody's ability to control in that day what was going on. Quickly after that, people said, Jack, in his mind, wanted it to go on. But what he had in front of him at that moment was something he couldn't support in the end, if that's what had come out, and it looked like there was nothing else. Well, several things happened, as John pointed out, that made it possible to say, okay, this does continue a process that can have a good end. But as you sat there that morning at 8 or 9 or 10 o'clock on the day of that vote and started going through it, nobody on the Republican side in the House could feel that this was going to come to a good end.
But you two obviously did not believe that this could come to a good end.
I
right?
didn't. John may have. I didn't, and I can tell you, I prepared in February and March to say to Jack, "I told you so. I told you so." And at the end, I mean, literally, Packwood had a weekend in which, the epiphany came, and he said, "I'm going to try. I'm going to go for the gold."
I was going to answer his question. Now, if there's one person that was affected, I think, during this little process by presidential politics, it might have been Bob Packwood. Okay. He thought that this was his opportunity to get the support of, if you will, the more conservative side, particularly the economic conservatives, in which he had a lot of problems. And I think if there was one person in this whole mix that was thinking president, you can argue every senator thinks president every day.
They all think
that. But this, I think that the idea that Packwood could link himself to Ronald Reagan, and Packwood could link himself to Jack Kemp, and Packwood was making speeches. I mean, he was into this then. And I think if there's one person that kind of fits into that category, it was Bob Packwood. I don't know when other things in his life started happening or whatever.
I'll tell you one
it didn't work out.
One thing that was in his life at that moment when he started marking up the bill was a minister who was running against him in the Republican primary for re-election to the U.S. Senate. Now, I don't disagree with Bob that he ultimately thought about the presidency, but that opponent eventually got somewhere around 40 or a little bit more % of the vote, and that was in that pro-family coalition definitely played on that because Packwood, being the most pro-abortion member of the Senate, certainly on the Republican side, needed an offset politically to get the pro-family movement just enough off his back to survive in that May 1986 Republican primary in Oregon.
So when did that transformation happen? I mean, you've already said that Packwood was sitting there in December 1985 hoping the thing would go down in the House so he didn't have to deal with it. The last thing he wanted was to deal with it. When he finally did take up the bill, the process was pretty ugly for a while. When did the transformation happen, and was it a positive transformation because he saw an opportunity, or a negative transformation because he thought he was going to get tarred with the failure and have problems in that?
I think
Yes.
Packwood looked at
Yes.
it.
Yes.
I think Packwood looked at this as a positive opportunity. But I don't know about the exact timing or dates or whatever. But I think Bob Packwood looks at this as a positive opportunity, looked at this and still looks at this as a positive
feels good
part
about it, no
of his
question.
political career.
So this the famous
Three-pitcher
lunch with
The Irish Times.
Diefendorfer, his tax aide. This happened, you think, because because of the combination of
markup, and it was going bad.
It was going down.
Can I just, before we leave Kemp in December 1985, I want to say one thing about Jack's leadership. That second vote, when he switched to keeping the bill alive, 9 other House Republicans voted with him. There were a total of 10 votes. I remember that vividly. It was the most counterintuitive thing I've ever seen a politician do, and he was right.
And how did his colleagues
They were furious.
with him?
Yes.
Yes, that's right. They raked him over the coals at the.
For
But
having sold them
it was a brilliant moment
So
for Kemp.
tell us about the raking over the coals.
Well, we had a stormy conference session where all of his, not just the Republican rank and file, but his own lieutenants were raking,
The belief was, I mean, last week we voted against it. For all intents and purposes, this bill hasn't changed, and now you're for it, and they just won, and we're going down this horrible path. How can you be so selfish, so dumb, I can believe, so gullible, whatever you want to say? And all those feelings were out there among his colleagues.
And what did he say?
Well, Jack's speeches on both voting on the rule and on persuading enough of his colleagues to go with the president the second time were both focused on those same 3 points: top rate, $2,000 exemption, and the
Cost of capital.
Cost of capital. And he voted against it because Rostenkowski didn't meet those criteria, and Packwood had said that morning it was not going to change when it got to the Senate. And so he voted against it. But then when he got Reagan involved and committing himself to veto anything that did not meet those 3 criteria.
That was the key.
But his colleagues don't believe him. Don't believe the President of the United States,
They
even
said
though.
it isn't Reagan, it's Jim Baker. We don't trust him.
I see.
Well, and remember, those House Republicans at that time didn't know Bob Packwood was about to have, or had just had the weekend before, some kind of a major change of attitude. They'd known of Bob Packwood for 5, 10, 15, 20, whatever it was, years. That was very different from the Bob Packwood that we saw in the next 6 months.
So you've explained why the $2,000 personal exemption was important. The top rate at this point is 50%. It's coming down to 38%. Why is that not good enough for the House Republicans?
Because we could do better. Jack thought we could do better. In fact, we did do better.
Did anyone think you could get to 28%?
No.
Well,
Nobody thought that.
But Camp Casson had a 25% rate with a 28% bubble.
28% was our
Right,
25.
and that was the top rate in the final bill.
So can we talk about the Senate a little bit?
Yeah.
Can I just want to say one quick thing, because I just want to get it on the record, because I think this has a lot to do with your question earlier about what's the right rate and what were you guys thinking about and what was your, and just again out in Waukesha or Oconomowoc or Wausau, Wisconsin, and this was Jack's speech, it was my speech, it was Newt's speech, it was certainly Henson Moore's speech. We'd all say, and I think Jack started, one of you guys might have written it, but that we're opening a bakery. And the only thing we sell is bread, and here is the way the tax system works. you're going to get taxed nothing on the first loaf of bread you sell. You're going to get taxed 10% on the second loaf of bread, 30% on the third, etc. 90% on the ninth loaf of bread, 100% tax on the 10th loaf of bread. Now, how many of us are going to bake 10 loaves of bread? Now, I said that speech, and Jack did, and Henson did, and Connie Mack did, and we would then argue, and I would be in the Waukesha Rotary Club, and I'd say, okay, now one of you is smart and think, okay, I'll leave the oven on so I won't use the energy, and I'll get that last loaf of bread out. It'll be the sixth loaf, and it's worth it because I won't have to spend the energy. And so all of us are arguing in the room here about, are we going to make 7 or 8 loaves of bread, or maybe 5 or 6? Who in the room is talking about making 11 loaves? Pause. Stop. That was the whole story, and that is the idea that Jack had. Not only thinking now about the Waukesha Chamber of Commerce or the Rotary Club, but I'm thinking about the way Jack thought. Jack was thinking about not making the 11th loaf, but the 20th loaf or the 25th loaf. And why in the world is our government got itself so tied up in knots that it can't figure out how to make as many loaves of bread? I mean, there are lots of reasons you can only make 10 loaves, but the tax system and the government is not the reason you should make only. Anyway, we all did that speech, and that is not just the speech, but it also is Jack Kemp in terms of the way he thinks about the world. It was never, ever static. It was always your piece of pizza can grow at the same time that mine does because we are going to expand the diameter of the pizza. And those of you that covered him in speeches, that was the whole deal. And that, so there wasn't a right rate. The idea was if you could just, the marginal rate was the question, and don't prevent someone from working that extra hour of overtime. Don't prevent someone from making that extra loaf of bread. Don't prevent someone from taking that next job so that they can, because of the tax rate. There are other reasons why they shouldn't make that decision to make more money on the margin, but the tax rate should never be one.
I just have to interject that the origin of that particular story or analogy you're talking about is Calvin Coolidge. If you look in Andrew Mellon's book, Taxation of People's Business, he reprints in an appendix a speech by Calvin Coolidge in which he says pretty much exactly that. And I don't know if I was the one who found it or whether Jude did, but Jack would I wish I had it in front of me. I mean, the exact wording he would repeat. And I guess over the years it just kind of morphed and all. But
and Reagan used it after Jack.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying it all goes back to Calvin Coolidge.
I thought these guys were the smart guys. It turns out the other thing that was part of this speech every single time was when John F. Kennedy said, "A rising tide lifts all ships." John F. Kennedy believed this. This is not a Republican idea. I never heard of the Coolidge part. But we always tied in Kennedy and Democrats. And Bradley, and to a degree, I don't know about Gebhardt, but Bradley didn't ever disagree with this kind of a analogy and this kind of a spin. The idea was that we want incentives in the system, we want to take away the disincentives and have opportunity in the system.
There's a long history of the party stealing each other's clothes on the tax issue. It goes back to the institution of the income tax in the first place under Abraham Lincoln. Rates got up to 77% during World War I. Mellon and Coolidge cut them. Kennedy reproduces the Mellon tax cuts. Reagan steals the Kennedy tax cuts, and that's the way it goes.
So fast forward back to 1986. An incredible. So Packwood and Diefendorfer have their two-pitcher lunch at the Irish Times, and they come out and have managed to get a 28% rate. And they did it with this. Was it 27 when it came out of the
final Senate passage? 27%.
27% rate, but they did it with this incredibly crude instrument that those of you who are economists can't think was particularly elegant, the passive loss rules, which did in the end clobber real estate pretty severely. What was the reaction to that tactic at the time.
Well, what they did, as I understand it, was simply come up with a concept of two rates and then turned it over to David Brockway and Eric Cook to figure out how to do it. And he looked at what was on the shelf, or some of the. Once you put a revenue raising or reducing measure into the system, it's there forever. Which is why if you have a way to say pay for the $2,000 exemption, you put it in the House side, it's going to come out on the Senate side if they're struggling for revenue, because that's just the way the process works. And so Brockway and Cook had the history as to how to do it. But the passive loss, I'm not sure who glommed onto that, but it was key to passing it. So that.
And did Kemp feel good about it, bad about it, or you get the rate down low enough, it doesn't matter?
It was, if you got the rates down low enough, people would care less about their deductions.
What it most affected was investors in shopping centers. I talked to people who invested in shopping centers at the time in the 80s, and what they explained to me is, we don't have bull markets and bear markets in our business. Because of the tax system, we always make money, no matter how crappy the shopping center is, no matter how bad the location. That's what it was. That was the single biggest impact of the repeal of passive loss, is that if you invested in a shopping center, it might not work. You might lose money on it. Prior to that, you could not, literally, if you were liquid, you could not lose money investing in a shopping center.
This is a classic loophole. This is a loophole. This is the very definition of the loophole. Right.
And the other thing is it represents fairness. I mean, it was called, one of the parts of this whole thing was called the fair tax, wasn't it?
That was
I can't remember.
Ours was the fair and simple tax.
Right. But we used fair all the time, fairness. And this was an example in which clearly it wasn't as meant to be. It wasn't fair.
That I think is very important is the change in the tax on capital gains. Is that it was because that was the deal. I mean, that was part of the deal that brought the Democrats along, was taxing capital gains at the same rate as ordinary income. And again, there was a threshold rate that everybody was willing to live with, that they felt that it wasn't too onerously punitive to capital gains, and they were willing to buy the deal. But I think also...
Was everybody willing to live with it? You talked this morning about splits, and was there a capital formation crowd that thought capital gains was too high?
In the sense that they were willing to vote for it and enact it into law. But I think that there was also a feeling on the Republican part, or the conservative side, is that this is a temporary setback. This is an issue that we're so strong on politically. The first opportunity, we'll just cut the rate back again. So I think it was very much of a, one step, 2 steps forward, 1 step, whatever it is.
Norman Ture definitely thought the '86 bill was a bad idea. It was getting rid of the loopholes was bad, pure and simple, and that's.
No one listened.
No, we just had enough votes on both sides of the aisle to.
But also, if memory serves, the way this happened in the Senate is you went through a markup which was day to day worse and worse and worse, and sort of at the end, Packwood said, "Okay, we're going to flip this." And then from that moment, that weekend, it literally was like 3 weeks from there to the whole thing's done, and it happened so fast that all the people who might have tried to fight to get back in to fight this were sort of lost, because once you got that rate that low coming out of the Senate, and that's where the president was, the momentum of that was irresistible, and they knew they had to move fast, so they did all those things.
As Jeff and I were talking about, the final vote was what, 93, 97, whatever?
97 to 3.
Yeah,
I mean,
the Senate
the
Finance
final
Committee
vote was just
20 zip.
the final vote was just overwhelming.
I want to recall that
I mean, it was just
situation.
things were just really.
Yes, by all means, Jeff.
It's middle of the night when it passes like 12:15 in the morning, 20 zip.
It was actually, I was there for final passage. It was 97 to 3. I can't even remember who the 3 were in the U.S. Senate of 1986. But I remember the champagne that Bradley mentioned, but I also remember sitting in the gallery, and Bradley's only other 2 guests in the gallery were Fred and Linda Wertheimer, who were close friends of his. And I said, my God, I'm in this with Fred Wertheimer, the head of Common Cause at the time. And I have to say that 97 to 3, and that was the 27% tax rate. the final passage, once they had the conference committee in the Senate, was 80-20 because they had a sense of perfection, of perfectibility in tax legislation that 17 people were able to bail out in the Senate between then and the final passage. I believe it was almost exactly 25 years ago when I was in the gallery with Bradley's wife and with Fred and Linda Wertheimer watching this 97-3. And I think it was, for me at least, it was a magic moment. It was just something that I will never see again, and certainly had never seen before, that you could have such unanimity on such a radical change in the country. And I also think that, important as Kemp Roth was, and I was, as you know, I was an early campaigner on that, and I believed in it, but I think that the impact of that overwhelming approval in the U.S. Congress and President Reagan signing it into law was the breakthrough element in the global change in tax policy. And I also believe that ending the punitively progressive, confiscatory progressive income tax was the key moment when socialism ended, as we know it. I think that there had been a transition. Earlier, it had been ownership of the means of production by the government. But after that, when that became somewhat unrealistic, it was high punitive income tax rates became the marker of socialism. And given what happened right after that magic moment, globally, third world, Europe, everywhere, I mean, some areas more extensively than others. Alan said at lunch that the most striking chapter in Jude's book was the chapter on the third world, where he explained how this could help the little guy in the third world.
78, long before it actually
Exactly. But it did happen. I mean, it actually did happen, and I think it was an extraordinary moment. It wouldn't have been possible without Ronald Reagan, Jack Kemp, and I believe Bill Bradley, who, as you could probably tell, we became fairly close. He was an important part of it too.
How did Kemp celebrate the win? Where did you all gather? Did you?
I don't remember.
Baseball game.
Was that it? Somebody has to have an anecdote.
No, I literally do not remember together.
Senate passage, where
he was
you were,
amazing.
and
I mean,
that was-
it was one of those things. I remember, it just sort of a satisfaction that this is all. He sort of, Jack was so positive, and I mean, if you failed at something, it was because you just didn't quite work hard enough. So work a little harder, and everything will work out. And I think he felt part of this was inevitable. I just had to force enough people to realize it along with me that it was inevitable.
But for most people, it went from impossible to inevitable the day of that Senate Finance Committee vote, 20-0 in the Senate Finance Committee.
And the finance vote before the conference committee vote. And it evolved. So it wasn't at the end. Yeah. It wasn't that.
But so
big a
no,
surprise.
you don't remember any celebration of that 20-0 vote?
We had a bottle of champagne back in the office and invited a few people over. And he came back from the floor and I handed him a glass of champagne and he just sort of threw it up in the air and, he was just very, very matter of fact about it. But he didn't drink the champagne, he just threw it up in the air.
And was this the day of final passage or the day of the Senate?
Senate Finance Committee.
I would think Senate Finance Committee.
Although that happened at like 12:30 at 1 o'clock in the morning.
Well, one of the votes was late.
The final
I can't
vote
remember
was-
the 20 vote.
And this may have been the next day
The
anyway.
97
We just decided
vote
to
was
do
late.
something because it was
You
so
were
late.
in the
Things
gallery
happened
late
so
at
late at
night.
night. We weren't
Yeah.
sitting around because the House side we weren't in.
Yeah.
The Senate was working late those nights, the House was not, and so we tended to
Saturday.
go home and watch things on C-SPAN if you had.
it was
no,
a Saturday
no
afternoon.
social life.
It was a sweet spot in tax policy because it was the last, and as far as I know, the only time that the rates were the same, top rates were the same for labor income, ordinary property income, and capital gains. And there were people who didn't like the equality. And remember what Bradley said in his interview about what would happen if you reintroduced a lower capital gains rate. You'll wind up with a 39% top rate, and that's exactly what happened.
Well, just a minute. Where was?
On that is all wrong.
same
Yeah.
39% rate comes in 1993. The capital gains isn't cut until 1997.
But the efforts began immediately. The effort to cut the capital gains rate began immediately.
Revenues came in under significantly year after year at the 28. It was a revenue enhancing measure.
Don't forget that Clinton did not raise the capital gains rate in '93. He delinked it. That was very important.
Where was Kemp?
That's right, they're delinked at
So
that point.
Kemp is responsible
39.6.
for this achievement, and then, as Bradley said, immediately the waves began to wash it away. Where was Kemp in the process as the waves were washing it away? As in, where was he on a capital gains differential?
Did he support bringing back a capital gains differential?
As I recall, he did. A couple of things happened here. Number one, you've got 1990, at which famously Dick Darman said to the social issue groups, it doesn't make any difference what promise he made. Nobody remembers this crap about not raising taxes. Oh, really? Well, 2 years later, he found out maybe 2 or 3 people remembered. It's like washed away. You know, the guy was at 93%, 18 months before that. So you had that going. Then you had a tax increase in 1993 that was done solely by the Democrats under Clinton. Then you had the budget deal in 1997. And the budget deal in 1997, at least my memory, I was working for Senator Lott at that time, is that Jack was very much in favor of reinstituting this as something that would provide incentives, since you weren't doing a lot on the tax side and they did a lot on the budget side on that. But I remember a meeting that Newt Gingrich and Trent Lott had with Erskine Bowles and Secretary of Treasury Robert Rubin. Imagine you got 2 guys in this room who have made fortunes, capital gains up and down, running businesses, and you have 2 guys in this room who are poor as church mouse, one of whom was a college professor, the other one who's been a member of Congress for the last 30 years. It was the worst example of setting up a meeting, and by God, they got it. They got the differential out of it. I kept saying a lot when we went in the meeting, don't do this. He said, don't worry, I've talked to Jack. I know what to say. He did.
You said sweet spot before. I would also argue that this is, if not the only, certainly one of the highest sweet spots in terms of Republicans and Democrats really seriously and honestly working together in recent legislative history. What you just saw with Bill Bradley, and if Jack were here, or those of us that can speak to this, we were not lying staff wasn't lying to each other, principals certainly were not lying to each other. We were absolutely trying to get this done, and Packwood bought on, and everyone. It was not only a sweet spot in terms of economics. It was a sweet spot in terms of nonpartisanship and good legislation resulting from it.
Could that happen now?
I don't think so.
Why?
I think it could. If you had the right
Forever
legislation.
the optimist.
Well, if you had the right piece of legislation, the problem is that each party is focusing on rewarding its base. Both the Democrats and the Republicans. Republicans trying to zero out the tax and property income, and Democrats trying to load all the taxes and property income and lower the.
Let me make an interjection as a reporter who watched this. We've talked a lot about the people playing at the top level. One of the things that struck me about this whole process was that on the professional staffs, and Bill Bradley made a reference to this, the Treasury Department, the congressional professional staffs, there wasn't a lot of partisanship, and they really worked very well together to try and figure out how to take these political impulses and mold them into. And Brockway was an example of that, but a lot of others as well. The fact that Ron Perlman could have been Ronald Reagan's tax guy and then move to the Hill and become Dan Rostenkowski's tax guy is the kind of thing that's sort of unimaginable to me now. I mean, the staff set up in Washington
These guys
today.
acted like appropriation staff people.
Well, that's right. They did. They acted like they were nonpartisan. They were just trying to do the deal. That seems to be gone.
Absent without leave.
The only way that anything like this could happen again would be if the President of the United States, in the same way that Ronald Reagan did, would embrace the Simpson, Erskine Bowles, or group of 6 there'd be a chance for some of this coming together, because you've got some Republicans who are no tax increase Republicans that are part of that group of 6, and others that are carefully watching what's happening. But with the president ready to veto, and I don't know what the hell Schumer must be doing to Durbin every day, but I mean, watching that tension in the Democratic Party, it seems to me that that whatever the Republicans do doesn't make any difference, because the Democrat president has decided he's going to be against his own Deficit Reduction Commission and 3 of his own Democratic colleagues, former colleagues and friends in the Senate.
Yet Obama made a deal with the Republicans on taxes, which shows he wants to get reelected. And to me, the fact that we have the American federalist system, and that the president is the most important player in it, precisely because he has to get 50% plus 1, and to do that he's got to get his party as well as some of the other party and the independents.
And you could
That's
argue
what
he should do that, because he certainly isn't going to be affected by a Democratic. Nobody's going to run to the left of him, and he has the nomination absolutely tied up.
Is he a good enough politician to do it?
Well, or does he want to? No, I think he could do it, and I think he could easily get reelected. Nobody's going to oppose him with the number of black voters in a Democratic primary. Nobody's going to beat him from the left. So he's got the Democratic nomination for sure. Does he want to be a leader 20 years from now as a person that crossed over and took and decided that the deficit was more important, and he could bring it together, or does he want to stay with his particular ideology?
First, I'd like to make a historical point here that I think is important, and that is that the 86 Act had predecessors in 1969 and 1976 in a tax reform process that began at the Treasury Department when Stanley Surrey came in as Assistant Secretary of Tax Policy. And if you go back and look, you'll see that when Kennedy put forward his tax proposal in 1963, it was essentially a tax reform effort. I mean, he had a whole bunch of loophole closers and stuff like that just got stripped out in Congress. They weren't interested in that stuff at that time. And then you had the creation of the tax expenditures budget, and you had the focus on tax loopholes that was very intense, that led to the Tax Reform Act of 1969, which was signed into law by Richard Nixon. You had the Tax Reform Act of 1976 that was signed into law by Gerald Ford. And so the 86 Act, followed only 10 years after the last major effort, which followed only a few years before that. Now we've had 25 years since the 86 Act, and nothing remotely like it in between has happened. And part of what has been lost is institutional knowledge about the whole idea of tax reform, which Republicans completely lost interest in once they got control of the House and Senate and were able to get rid of PAYGO so they could just cut taxes. Why should we bother with tax reform? Who cares? We'll just cut taxes anyway we damn well feel like. And now it's only because the deficit has come back on center stage that has paralyzed the ability, I think, going forward to have any kind of significant unpaid for tax cuts, that now we're back in the same situation we were in early 82, where you have to talk about tax reform because it's the only game in town.
But Bruce, Kennedy's tax reform was not a revenue neutral tax reform. It was, in static terms, it was minus 23% in rate reductions and plus 5% on tax reform. So there was a tax reform element to it, but it was essentially a rate reduction.
I understand that. I'm just saying that there was a history of tax reform that dates back to 1963 at least, of which the 86 Act would follow, historically, and since we've now had 25 years of no tax reform, I think that a lot of the knowledge and understanding of the whole point of it has been lost, and the whole staff situation is very different at the Treasury and at the Joint Committee and lots of other places. And I think that this is going to make it harder because a lot of stuff has to be relearned from scratch that was known in 1986 but has since been forgotten.
What we're trying to do is help people relearn what we once knew.
So we've reached the end of our time, but so I will give anybody who feels the urge final word about Jack Kemp or about the 86 tax reform to say his final piece before we
We kind of skipped over Bob Packwood, and it was partly my fault, but I wanted to give him the credit he deserves. Once Reagan laid out the 35%, 2,000 plus no worse capital treatment, he immediately fit into that framework. There was a first wave that lasted several weeks in which he tried to kind of be the little boy with his thumb in the dike in Holland, and there were give up a little bit on this, a little bit of that. After a few weeks, my memory is that wasn't working. The bill was dissolving into the House bill very quickly on any revenue neutral basis.
He was getting
hammered.
There was a
Fred
magazine.
Barnes did a piece in the New Republic called Senator
Packwood. Yeah.
And so Packwood, being a very smart politician, knew that he needed to try something different. And that was the background of the 2 or 3 pitcher lunch. I can't quite remember. It was 2 people and 3 pitchers, or 3 people and 2 pitchers.
I think it was 2 pitchers.
They don't remember either, but I would.
Yeah,
but
no cap to the second. Who
but
cares?
Packwood, once he fit into that framework, it didn't work in the incremental way. Then he took the all-at-once leap into a 27% top rate, and let's reason back from there. He did a phenomenal job. Bradley was helpful because he was on the finance committee. Moynihan was very helpful. He did a phenomenal job of bringing everything together. He gave in to the pro-family people on the $2,000 personal exemption. I'll never forget bringing Paul Weyrich and a bunch of pro-lifers into Packwood's office. It was one of the oddest couple.
Wow.
But I think Packwood, professionally, just as a professional politician, not an ideologue, he really deserves enormous credit for having such a good bill come out of the Senate.
Okay. Thank you so much. What a fascinating day. I think it's everything that we hoped it would be, right? I think it's great oral history, and it's
Not the last word. You're coming back to them at some point individually, right?
Yes, absolutely. You will all be interviewed at length individually, but this was a grand performance by everybody. So I'm grateful, and I know that the Kemp Foundation is grateful. Jimmy, you wanted to say some final words.
Well, I'm James Kemp, president of the Jack Kemp Foundation, and I'm the youngest of Jack and Joanne's 4 children. When each of us was growing up and we'd leave the house, Dad had much counsel for us, but the one phrase that sticks out in all of our minds is when he would say, "Be a leader." The Jack Kemp Foundation's mission is to develop, engage, and recognize exceptional leaders. Today's event has been about recognition of an exceptional leader, Jack Kemp, who recognized that it was not his efforts alone that furthered what he called the cause, but that it was a team of individuals. The foundation exists to capture Dad's legacy of leadership and help develop and engage future leaders and current leaders while recognizing the ones who are leading this country into the future. And to no one's surprise, we will do it with an optimistic belief that this country, founded on incredible American principles and universal human principles, has potential that goes far beyond what many of us can think of in the midst of the details of what often is ugly legislation and the ways that it gets put together. Today's example and lessons will be learned, and we're incredibly grateful for this opportunity. Real quickly on the programs that we have with the foundation, today's effort is a part of the Kemp Legacy Project, where we have the Kemp collection, over 400 boxes of my dad's papers at the Library of Congress, where they're archived, and we're in the process of getting those digitized now that the library has finished their archiving, and we'll make a portion of the Kemp collection available online. The Kemp Oral History is another component of the Kemp Legacy Project, and that's what we're doing here today. We've had another symposium like this one already in Buffalo on Jack Kemp, the Buffalo Bill, and Jack Kemp, the Buffalo politician, the Buffalo congressman. And we will have subsequent symposiums as a part of the oral history. And finally, we have, the Kemp Chair, our most important recent announcement. Mort, I don't know how I could have forgotten it. We have the Kemp Chair for Political Economy, which provides for a senior scholar to be residing at the Library of Congress, doing scholarly research and publication on what Kemp understood to be the American idea. And we're very proud that this week Dr. James Billington, the Librarian of Congress, announced that Mort Kondracki is the first Kemp Chair. Mort, thank you for your leadership of this Kemp oral history, and we're looking forward to you taking the Kemp Chair. When we set up the Kemp Foundation, though, we knew that it had to be more than just about the past. Dad was not about the past, he was about the future. And today he would have enjoyed this. None of you would have been able to talk nearly as much as you were, because he would have corrected you on the way it really happened. But when we recognized at the foundation that we couldn't really build something that was only focused on the past, we took our lead from Dad, who, when he and I worked together at Kemp Partners, he had a Buffalo Bill football player in his off-season come be an intern with us. He happened to be a 6'7", 330-pound offensive lineman, and anytime Dad would walk out of the office to meetings, when Brad Butler, a University of Virginia graduate, was interning with us, he'd say, "Brad, come on, let's go." And out Jack Kemp would walk with a 6'7", 330-pound offensive tackle and take him to meetings. We set up the Kemp Leadership Academy to build on what Dad did. The Kemp Leadership Academy is the resource in Washington, D.C. for current and former professional and Olympic athletes who are interested in public policy and potentially public service. And so we've been working with our first professional athlete, Brendan Evans, who's a 24-year-old tennis player who happens to be, I believe, he's been accepted to, and I believe he's going to enroll, as it happens, at the University of Virginia. So we're excited about that. Our final program is called the Kemp Forum, which is a debate and discussion series providing a platform for the civil competition of ideas. We've heard a lot about Dad's civility and respect for people, and the Kemp Forum is a way that we can push forward the efforts to have the real competition of ideas. So that's where we engage exceptional leaders. The Kemp Leadership Academy is where we develop exceptional leaders. And I want to thank a few people. First of all, I'd like to thank Michelle Van Cleve, who heads the Kemp Oral History Project for the foundation, and her former fellow staff member, Marcy Robinson, who really got this idea started and introduced us to Alan Murray. So Alan, thank you for your guidance to Marcy and to Michelle and to us. And that brings us to the Miller Center. Governor Bliles, thank you for your incredible support and kindness to all of the Kemps as we've come down, and you've put the resources of the Miller Center at our availability. And Russell, thank you for your incredible guidance and wisdom in teaching some who are neophytes in oral history about how to do it. Mort, I've thanked you. I'd like to thank Brian Williams, who is our oral historian guiding this project behind the scenes. And panelists, you all have done me a great service by helping fill in the pieces of what was happening while I was in my elementary and teenage years and heard, I always got criticized anytime I said, "Dad, what are you talking about taxes? What is this talk about taxes?" "Jimmy, it's not taxes. We're not cutting taxes. We're cutting tax rates. Get it straight." So his encouragement certainly always carried over into the house. You know, this is very special for all of us, and on behalf of my mom and my siblings, I do want to thank you all. The Kemp Network is an incredible one. It's not because of Dad. He was wonderful. We loved him. Sometimes we didn't love him. But he tapped into something that we think is at the core of this great nation, a cause that leads people to do things that aren't only in their self-interest, but are in the interest of their families and future generations. And we thank you all for your work and participating in this project. Thanks for coming, and have a safe drive back to wherever you're going.